I don't know if you are anything like me, but at some point in your past, you've probably been in a fender bender of some sort or some sort of a car accident. I don't know, maybe there's somebody here that hasn't been, but it's a it's hopefully something we don't encounter every day, but we have a word for these things when they occur. We call them accidents, car accidents. I'm going to relate a couple of them to you this morning, if that's okay. Hopefully, I won't reveal too much that I shouldn't be revealing. But anyway, when I was a young man, I was still in high school and was working about 30 minutes away from home. And uh, one night, we lived in upstate New York, and the weather there was somewhat like the weather is here. There was probably a little bit more snow, at least at that time, than there is here. But I was on my way home from work, and it was already dark. It was probably 5:30, 6 o'clock, and I was driving down the road. And you know how the roads are. This was in the middle of the winter, and there were, you know, how the plows go, and they stack up these huge snowbanks on the sides, and the roads were pretty clear. But I was driving on the road, and of course it was dark, and lo and behold, I don't know, I was probably going about 50 miles an hour, and I hit one of those spots. You've hit one of those spots before, I'm sure, and you just can all of a sudden feel that, oh, the car's not making traction anymore. I'm just kind of sliding along on the ice. And so, you know, the car started turning a little bit, and I'm turning the wheel back to try to get the tires to go back. And of course, I know you're not really supposed to do that, because when they do grip, you know, that what happens anyway. So I'm turning, and then all of a sudden it did run out of that spot, and the wheels threw me into a spin. And, you know, I mean, just a teenager, really. And so next thing you know, I'm spinning, and I wipe out this snowbank that was right beside neighbors. It was coming down our road, actually, on the way home, and wiped out the snowbank and landed where the snowbank had been. It was a big snowbank, and so I just demolished the snowbank. And so here I'm sitting stationary now in the car, walking distance from our house. And so, you know, I got out and went down the road and walked in. Dad's watching TV, and I say, "Okay, Dad, I just got in an accident." And of course, he is alarmed, you know, and I tell him what happened, and we go down and look at the car, and there was a little bit of damage on the door where it hit the snowbank, you know, and a little dent, and maybe a little, one of the fenders was rolled under just a little bit, and he had to pull that out. And neighbor came out and with his, you know, big truck, and pulled the car off of where it was, and we were able to drive it home. And you know, that was one of those things, and yes, it was an accident, but the truth be told, I bear responsibility, because I was going faster than I should have been at the time. And even though, you know, the conditions were good where I had been driving, all of a sudden I encountered a patch that was different, and it was ice, black ice. And so, but the Lord took care of me through that time. I praise him for that. And I look back on that and think, you know, what could have happened? I came out of it without a scratch. I don't even think the car had airbags at the time. And certainly there weren't any deployed. I don't even remember if they had airbags. And the car was drivable and usable. And it was just one of those things that kind of, I was able just to remember what the consequences could have been if that accident had been worse. But again, we call that an accident. There was another accident a few years later, quite a few years later. It was about 16 years ago. My wife and I were getting ready. We were moving from Tennessee up here. And I don't know if any of you have been up Route 75 from Knoxville as you come north into Kentucky, and you come over Jellicoe Mountain. And there's a big, you know, I don't know which big ravine, but it's very, very deep there. And I was driving a truck and trailer, 16-foot trailer, and my son was in it with me, and Dawn was driving her car. And she had a couple of kids and a couple of cats in the car with them, and all of it. And I get a phone call, because we had cell phones fortunately, at that time, and she calls me and says, and she's crying, I mean, it was one of those, they just had no idea. Well, she was driving along and all of it was raining, and all of a sudden, again, she lost traction. And it was actually not unsimilar to the accident that I had when I was young and just lost traction. And she was in the right lane, but somehow, I don't know if she actually spun. I think she spun and ended up going across the other side, and all the trucks and cars on there, no one was interfering with her. And she ended up, again, sliding into the ditch on the left-hand side, and it was right before the, that big bridge there coming across, and so, again, that was it was very shaken up, but that was one of those situations where what could have happened could have been a few, mile down or half mile down, and then she could have gone off down into the ravine and probably been killed. But, no one was injured in that. The car was totaled. And of course, so we come out of that. I ended up going back and picking her up, and it seemed like quite an ordeal at the time. Actually, I'll just go into just a little bit more detail. When we ended up going back and to where I don't remember if it was anyway, we took the car, had to have the car towed back there, and the next exit back. And when we got there, across the street, there was a church. And I don't remember exactly how it worked out. We needed to use a bathroom or something. And so we went across the street to use the bathroom there, and they were having a church dinner. It was a Wednesday night. They were having a church dinner. They just invited us in, strangers off the street, invited us in to join them, to sit down and eat with them. I can just remember the overwhelming sense of thankfulness to be in a place that was safe, after this horrendous potential accident had occurred. And, we didn't know what was going to happen in the future. And yet here we were among Christians, believers, having a meal on them while we waited for, the car to be brought. We had to rent a car through insurance anyway. And so, we just go through these things, and then you wonder, why does this happen? Why does God allow these things to happen? And then the next year, then I can remember exactly when it was, after we got the check for that car, I found out, I got a letter from the IRS that I had made a mistake. I think it was a year and a half or 2 years before on my taxes. And as it turned out, the amount that we owed after the penalties and everything on the taxes was to the dollar the amount of the check that came from the insurance company for the car. Now, that doesn't make us feel any better about the car, but it allows, God sometimes allows to connect those dots for us to see the things he brings us through, and the way he, in that way, is not only keeping us safe, but is providing for us as well. And so that was one of those things. It was a difficult time for sure, but God took us through that. But those are two examples of things that we call accidents. And yet we know that if we believe in a sovereign God, there isn't any such thing as an accident. And you could say, well, in one way, we bear responsibility. I've always felt that the tires were a little bit wore down, and it was my fault that happened because of that. I should have had the tires replaced. And on the other accident, I was going too fast. Well, but nonetheless, God had a purpose for these things. And in some cases, we see the purpose, and in some cases, we don't. Certainly, God allowed a church to minister to us, and God allowed us to receive the ministry of this church through that. And he provided for our needs. He kept us safe. He reminded us that he's in control. All of these things happen. And of course, you hear that everything happens for a reason, but that's kind of not really what it is. God allows, God orchestrates, God brings about all of these events for a purpose. And as we followed Paul through the book of Acts, or through the latter parts of the book of Acts here, and today we're going to be in Acts chapter 27 and going into 28. So it's hopefully we'll make it through by noon. I'm going to do my very best. But as we walk through this chapter this morning, now remember the things that Paul has been through on his missionary journeys. Repeatedly, he was chased out of town by the Jews. They accused him. They tried to stone him. They accused him of all sorts of things, blasphemy, and then in the last few chapters, we saw even as Paul returned to Jerusalem with the intent of bringing back this offering from the Gentiles to the Jews, because Judea had been in a drought and there was need, and so he had brought back this offering. And while he was there, in the short time that he was there, the Jews once again tried to stir up trouble and were going to stone him. And the Romans actually saved him and eventually delivered him to Caesarea. And Paul had appealed to Caesar because he was a Roman citizen. And so we have these kind of complex set of events going on, but we've seen all through these chapters, and I've said before and I'll say again, these chapters are going to be redundant in one sense, in the sense that we see God has a plan for Paul. He's told Paul what that plan was, and we see God orchestrating the plan in spite of man's intervention, in spite of, even in this case, we're going to see nature intervening, and we're going to see this, that God is still in control and he's still bringing about his plan as he will. And while these events don't always make sense to us, and I know that we are going through things this morning, we're going to be looking at Paul's shipwreck this morning. And everything, it's not just the shipwreck, but everything that happens here. And I know that some of us are going through those things, and we may not be going through the things that Paul was, like a shipwreck and this going back to Rome to face potential and likely eventual death. And yet, we're going through things. We're experiencing things that we don't understand. And my examples this morning started out talking about accidents. And those things are things that we go through and we don't understand them. And sometimes they're of our making and sometimes they're not. But there can be health issues. There can be deaths. There can be all sorts of things that we go through. There can be loss of jobs. There can be loss of relationships with family members or with loved ones. There can be just difficulties that we don't understand right now. But we can be assured of this one thing, that just as Paul was called, and he was called for a very specific purpose, as long as he continued on that goal, God was taking him through this. God was going to accomplish the plan that he had in store for Paul. And so really what we're going to see this morning is, as Jesus promised that Paul would go to Rome and God would declare the gospel in Rome, we're going to see the culmination of this journey back to Rome. But it's not an easy one. We're going to pick it up reading in verse 1 of chapter 27 and stop along the way to make comment, and then we're going to, at the end, kind of zoom out and again look and see how this applies to us or could apply to us today. Verse 1. Now, just before I start, I remember at the end of the previous chapter, Paul had opportunity to give the gospel message to Herod Agrippa II and to Festus and to Herod's sister, who was also his wife, as I understand it. What did he key in on? He always keyed in on the resurrection, because the resurrection is like the linchpin of our salvation. If there's no resurrection, then the death of Christ means nothing, because there's no power, there's no future, there's no eternity that we can look forward to. But there is a resurrection, and there's a resurrection because there was first a death. Jesus died for us. And so Paul always keyed in on those things. And we're not going to see Paul give the plan of salvation. We're not going to see Paul preach a sermon in this chapter. We're just going to see events happening. We're going to see interactions between Paul and different people that he encounters. But verse 1, right after Agrippa had told Festus, if he hadn't appealed to Caesar, he would have been a free man. But God had a purpose. And so he did appeal to Caesar. And so now Paul was going to be going to Rome. And when it was decided that we should sail for Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. And embarking in a ship of, please forgive me on pronunciation of a few of these words, Adramyttium, which was about to sail to the ports along the coast of Asia, we put to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. Now, you'll remember a few chapters back when Paul was in Thessalonica, or Macedonia, he had encountered some trouble there, and there were two men that were dragged out, and Gaius and Aristarchus. And so Aristarchus, it said that they were people who had been with Paul. They were of the brothers, and they couldn't find Paul. They were looking for him, but instead they dragged these two brothers out. And so Aristarchus was someone who had been with Paul through problems on his missionary journeys, and here he is, he's still with Paul. And so he's accompanying Paul. Here he's leaving, apparently he went to Caesarea, and now is going to go to Rome with Paul. Just imagine. This isn't like a missionary trip, like you say, well, I'm going to accompany someone on a missionary trip to, Timbuktu or wherever it might be. This is going with Paul on a journey as he's prisoner back to Rome. And so he's accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. The next day, we put in at Sidon. Who's we? Remember who's writing this book, this historical account, is Luke. And of course, we've seen throughout the book of Acts where sometimes the pronouns change from we to they, and then back to we. And so apparently now Luke is here accompanying Paul. So Luke is one that is accompanying Paul. Luke, a Greek, not a Jew, he's a Greek. And he's accompanying Paul as well. So the next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him leave to go to his friends and be cared for. Now, it's interesting, again, we see this, and we've seen this repeated throughout these chapters, where the Romans, for whatever reason, are kindly to Paul. They give him a degree of freedom. They allow him here to go and to be with his friends. Julius treated Paul kindly. They've done this before, where he was kind of under house arrest instead of actual arrest, like those 2 years that he had spent while Felix was still a governor of Caesarea, and Paul was there. He was basically under house arrest. Okay. And putting out to sea from there, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus, because the winds were against us. Notice the wording that Luke continues here. There's this, the winds were against us. And when we had sailed across the open sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra and Lycia. And there the centurion, Julius, the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing for Italy and put us on board. And we sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty off, and I don't know how to pronounce the CN. I've never seen that. I don't know how to pronounce that. Cnidus. And as the wind did not allow us to go further, we sailed for the lee of Crete off Salmone, coasting along it with difficulty. We came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lycia. And just continue to notice the description that Luke gives. The winds were against us. This was difficult. This wasn't, it's like we're going against the grain, so to speak. And I can't help but think, we know that Luke was the author also of the book of Luke. We know that Luke described those scenes of Jesus calming the storm when his disciples were afraid in the ship. We know Luke understood that Jesus was in control over the storm, and yet here he's using this language that's saying the storm was against us. The wind kept blowing against us. This was difficult. We went slowly, even though we tried to go. It was difficult. Since much time had passed, and the voyage was now dangerous, because even the fast was already over, so that just is giving us a sense of timing. This was probably into October, and they were really, entering a time that on the Mediterranean would have been treacherous for them. And so Paul advised them, saying, Sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of the cargo in the ship, but also of our lives. But the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship than to what Paul said. And because the harbor was not suitable to spend the winter in, the majority decided to put out to sea from there, on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, facing both southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. And so now they're looking for safety. They're looking for a safe harbor where they can spend the winter. And Paul had already warned them, really operating as a bit of a prophet in this case. And they didn't listen to him. Verse 13, now when the south wind blew gently, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, in other words, okay, things are going to work out because it's a little bit more calm, they weighed anchor and sailed along Crete close to the shore. But soon a tempestuous wind, called the northeaster, struck down from the land. We have nor'easters, don't we? They're not very pleasant. Weather coming in off the Atlantic Ocean into usually in the northeast and coming down that way. It's very cold and just very bad weather when that happens. So it was a northeaster. And when the ship was caught and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along. So here they are in the ship, and they're trying to sustain, and yet they couldn't stand it. They couldn't withstand it, and so they just had to go with the wind. The wind was so strong. Running under the lee of a small island called Cauda, we managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat. Apparently they had what you might consider a lifeboat, but a smaller boat, that they were basically in tow, and so that they could probably use it when they dropped anchor to go into land. At any rate, so they were trying to secure the boat. After hoisting it up, they used supports to undergird the ship. Then, fearing that they would run aground on the Syrtis, they lowered the gear, and thus they were driven along. Again, this picture of, they're just at the whim of the sea, at the mercy of the sea itself, and not able to go where they wanted to go. They were basically just being driven. Verse 18, since we were violently storm-tossed, they began the next day to jettison the cargo. And of course, when the ship is too heavy and you're worried that the ship is going to sink, what do? You start throwing things overboard. And here they were. They were like, this was getting getting serious. If they're throwing cargo overboard, it's getting serious. And on the third day, verse 19, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days. They couldn't even see the sky. It was so stormy. And no small tempest lay on us. All hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. So here they are now. They had faced all of these things. And what is it that is fighting them, that they are trying to resist? It's the power of God through the storm. But of course, they're not recognizing that. They're not seeing that. But they come to this point where all hope is lost. And they now believe that they're going to die. We come to times in life when all hope is lost, don't we? And they're usually not times that we like to look back on. Well, we like to look back on them, but we don't really look back on them with a smile. We think, boy, God brought us through that, whatever it might be. Well, here they were at one of those points, and all hope was lost. In verse 21, since they had been without food for a long time, I just want us to stop and realize that when you're out on a stormy sea, one of the last things that you want to do is eat. Because when you eat and you're on a stormy sea, what is going to happen? You're going to get sick, and you're going to end up just wishing that you hadn't eaten. So they hadn't eaten for a long time because there was so much storm going on here. But here they are, verse 21, since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among them and said, men, you should have listened to me. That's what we like to hear, isn't it? I hate to say I told you so. Well, Paul, he went there. You should have listened to me and not have set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss. So through these situations, through this difficulty that has happened, what has happened is that Paul has actually gained in his credibility with these men in the ship. And so now he's speaking. It's also interesting. Here he is the prisoner. And yet he's speaking as if he's an advisor. I mean, he's traveled. I read somewhere that in the missionary journeys that he went on, he probably traveled some 2,500 miles in his life. That's a long ways when you don't have, a car to drive. And a good part of that was on the sea and on land as well. Here he is now acting as advisor. Verse 22, yet now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. Don't worry, we're not going to lose any life. We're just going to lose the ship. Is that good news or not? Well, then he goes on and he gets more specific. For this very night there stood before me an angel of the God of Israel, to whom I belong and be, I read that wrong with a wrong emphasis. For this very night there stood before me an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. So there's Jesus once again reminding Paul, I told you were going to go to Rome. I told you were going to stand before kings and you were going to, deliver the gospel. You're going to stand before Nero. This is the purpose that I have set for you. I told you that was your purpose, and my intent for you is not going to be thwarted. My plan for you is not going to be interfered with, not by anything. And don't forget, Paul, I'm the one in charge of these wind and waves. You must stand before Caesar, and behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. In other words, God is going to not only deliver you to safety, but he's going to deliver all those who are with you to safety as well. They had come to this point where they feared for their lives. They thought that all was lost. Hope was lost. And yet Jesus came and told Paul that all were going to be saved. So Paul says, so take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on some island. The difficulty's not over, but God told me that this is what's going to happen. Now, we don't have those visions from God today. not as far as I know. We do have his word. We do know what the end of the story looks like. We're a little bit sketchy on some of the in-between before we get there. We don't know exactly what all the ins and outs are, but we know the end of the story. We know that God has a purpose for us as well. And whatever time it is that we were born for such a time as this. We were born at the right time. We're living at the right time in history. We're where God planted us, and we're here for a reason. And God is going to accomplish his purpose through us, sometimes in spite of us, if you remember Jonah. So Paul now says, take heart, for I have faith in God. It's interesting, he doesn't challenge them to have faith in God. He says, I believe what God told me. We're going to be safe. But we must run aground on some island. There's going to be another accident, but we're going to come through it okay. You know, as I describe those accidents that I was in the past, those are in the past, praise the Lord, and we came through them okay. Well, there's probably going to be something in the future that I'm not aware of yet. And I'm glad I'm not aware of it yet, because I'd probably be worrying about it. But the truth of the matter is that whatever that is, God's going to bring us through that as well. We must first run aground on an island. Verse 27, when the 14th night had come, 14th night. Just think of that. 14 days is a long vacation as it is. Usually by the 14th day, you're saying, oh, I can't wait to get home. No, they're just on their way. And they've been fighting this storm. They've been dealing with all of this stuff. This is the 14th night, and they're not there yet. When the 14th night had come, as we were being driven across the Adriatic Sea, about midnight, the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. So they took a sounding and found 20 fathoms. And a little farther, and they took a sounding again and found 15 fathoms. So they were nearing land. And fearing that we might run on the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for the day to come. They're praying now. They just didn't want to run into the rocks. And here they were heading that way, and they put down the anchors. They just please, God, just allow us to get through to the daylight so we can at least see the land, see what's going on here. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship and had lowered the ship's boat. So once again, now they had lowered that boat that they lowered it down, and the sailors were seeking to escape into the sea under pretense of laying out anchors from the bow. Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. And the soldiers cut away from the ropes of the ship's boat and let it go. So they were trying to get to the boat. Paul told the centurion and the soldiers, can't let them do it. So they cut that boat loose. They listened to Paul. They let the boat go so that the men would stay in the ship. They wouldn't have any place to go. It's a little bit like Cortez burning the ships, isn't it? Verse 33, and as day was about to dawn, Paul urged them all to take some food, saying, today is the 14th day that you have continued in suspense and without food. You haven't been eaten for 14 days, having taken nothing. So therefore I urge you to take some food, for it will give you strength, for not a hair is to perish from the head of any of you. And when he had said these things, he took bread and, giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. Nothing like the example that you set when you lead. He told them to eat. He sat down and he was going to eat himself. But what did he do? He took time out to publicly thank God for God's provision. I imagine he didn't just thank God for the food. He just says, giving thanks to God. I mean, we're not told exactly what he said, but I imagine, knowing Paul and his character, he probably thanked God for God's deliverance of them so far, and that God had promised to deliver them safely, ultimately. And of course, all of these, Gentiles, mostly Gentiles, are observing this and seeing they've already now learned to trust Paul more than they did at the beginning, because they saw, what had happened. Paul was right, and they were listening to him. They'd cut the boat away. They were listening to him, and now they see him demonstrate that in the middle of all this, he sits down and prays before his meal. It's a little thing, maybe. We go to a restaurant after church. It's not uncommon on a Sunday afternoon to see families bow their heads and thank the Lord for the food. It's always uplifting when you see that happen. You don't really know a lot about them, but you at least know that they fear God and they're thankful for God's provision. Well, they all were encouraged and ate some food themselves. So now Paul was leading, and they were following Paul. They were listening to him and heeding his advice. And then Luke says in parenthetical comment, we were in all 276 persons in the ship. It's just like Luke, isn't it, to give us that detail? That's a lot of people. That's a lot of people. A lot of churches across the country today wish that they had 276 people in church, don't they? Oh, I know there's mega churches, but most churches aren't mega churches. Most churches would love to have the opportunity to live the gospel, to live out your faith in front of 276 people in this way. They were a captive audience. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship, throwing out the wheat into the sea. So now, not only are they throwing out their cargo, they're throwing out their food. And so, apparently, they're believing Paul that they're going to be safe. Verse 39, now when it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach, on which they planned, if possible, to run the ship ashore. So they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea. They just cut the anchors now and left them right there in the sea. At the same time, loosening the ropes that tied the rudders, then hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach. But striking a reef, they ran the vessel aground. The bow struck and remained immovable, and the stern was being broken up by the surf. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any could swim away and escape. See, the soldiers knew that if the prisoners escaped, they would be liable and they would be killed. And so they didn't want to allow any of the prisoners to escape. They thought it would be better for us just to kill them and be done, and then we don't have to worry about us. Then at least we know they didn't escape. But the centurion, wishing to save Paul, here once again we have this Julius, who had already been kind to Paul, and he realizes, okay, well, if they're going to kill the prisoners, that means they're going to kill Paul. And it specifically says that he wished to save Paul. Why? I don't know. I don't know why Julius was, had this feeling toward Paul that he would care about him in this way. But he did. God somehow gave Julius this desire to keep Paul alive. Maybe it was because Julius was, in charge of this prisoner of Rome, and if anything happened to Paul, then Julius would be in trouble. I don't know, but he wanted to keep Paul alive, and so he kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for the land. and the rest on planks or on pieces of the ship. And so it was that all were brought safely to land. I heard one pastor say that this was the first surfing that took place in the Bible. They all caught planks or pieces of the ship that had broken apart. So the broken ship, the fact that it broke apart actually allowed them to survive. It actually gave them something, that it became their salvation in a sense. If the ship hadn't have broken apart, they wouldn't have had those planks to grab onto and float into the land. They were all brought safely to land. Isn't that what Paul had said would happen? Isn't that what God had told Paul would happen? Verse 1 of chapter 28. After we were brought safely through, we then learned that the island was called Malta, and the native people showed us an unusual kindness. That's interesting as well. An unusual kindness. Just even in Luke's, assessing of the situation, the people of Malta were showing them unusual kindness. For they kindled a fire and welcomed us all, because it had begun to rain and was cold. When Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and put them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened on his hand. When the native people saw the creature hanging from his hand, they said to one another, "No doubt this man is a murderer. Though he has escaped from the sea, justice will not allow him to live." And they just believed, this idea probably of fate, that he wasn't, if he was bad, if he was evil, then this was going to happen to kill him in spite of his escape from sea. And so, they were just assuming this. He, however, shook off the creature into the fire and suffered no harm. And they were waiting for him to swell up or suddenly fall down dead. But when they had waited a long time and saw no misfortune come to him, they changed their minds and said that he was a god. So we can clearly see that these people of Malta don't understand the God that Paul has been preaching all his life. They're now calling him a god. It's interesting. I imagine Paul had something to say about that, but Luke doesn't record that for us. Why doesn't Luke record this for us? Well, Luke has a purpose to tell us that Paul got to Rome. That's Luke's purpose here, and I imagine Paul did probably preach the gospel to these on Malta, but we're not told of that. Now, in the neighborhood of that place were lands belonging to the chief man of the island, named Publius, who received us and entertained us hospitably for 3 days. It happened that the father of Publius lay sick with fever and dysentery. And Paul visited him and prayed, and putting his hands on him, healed him. And when when this had taken place, the rest of the people on the island who had diseases also came and were cured. So now Paul is having a regular healing service. He's doing the same kind of thing that Jesus did when the sick came to him, and those with demons, and those who needed Jesus. Of course, they needed Jesus for more than physical ailments. And Jesus always made sure that they understood that this was just an outward thing. And they had faith. Verse 10, they also honored us greatly, and when we were about to sail, they put on board whatever we needed. So now we have, landing on this island, Malta. We have these miraculous things taking place. We have Paul being bit by a poisonous snake, and they thought he was going to die. I assume it was poisonous, because otherwise they wouldn't have thought he was going to die, but they did. We have him shaking it off and being fine. Then we have them, the chief whose father was sick. We have Paul healing him. And then we have others, and it doesn't specifically say that Paul healed the others, but says well, it does say they came and were cured. And now they provided them with that, whatever they needed. They loaded on the ship. Verse 11, after 3 months, we set sail in a ship that had wintered in the island. So now they're into probably March. A ship of Alexandria with the twin gods as a figurehead. Putting in at Syracuse, we stayed there for 3 days. And from there, we made a circuit and arrived at Rhegium. And after 1 day, a south wind sprang up. And on the second day, we came to Puteoli. There we found brothers and were invited to stay with them for 7 days. So now they were with the brothers. And what does Luke say next? This little understatement of the year. And so we came to Rome. This chapter and a half of these troubles, of these difficulties, of these experiences that had given Paul the opportunity to demonstrate faith in Jesus and to demonstrate that they were going to be delivered safely. And so we came to Rome. He had opportunity to preach the gospel, no doubt, even though it isn't specifically recorded here. He had the opportunity to heal those who were ill and who had diseases. And so we came to Rome. God's plan was accomplished to bring him to Rome. Of course, we know it's not over yet. Paul had to stand before Caesar. And there are things that Luke doesn't record in the book of Acts. It ends kind of abruptly, in a sense. We'll see that next week. And so we came to Rome. And the brothers there, when they heard about us, came as far as the Forum of Appius and 3 taverns to meet us. On seeing them, Paul thanked God and took courage. Paul was especially thankful now to be united with these brothers in the Lord. These brothers to whom he had written a letter that knew of him, but maybe had never seen his face. And now God has seen fit to bring them together. Can you imagine? And we really can't say reunion if they had never seen each other before. It's more like a union, a first-time reunion. Really makes me think of what glory will be like. There will be many in heaven we've never met, but they will be our brothers and sisters. They will be in the family of God, and we will thank God, and of course we will take courage. But here Paul is at the culmination of this journey to Rome that we've been talking of and reading of and seen predicted by Jesus over and over through these last chapters of the book of Acts. But this morning, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. I don't have a lot of time here to spend unless you want to skip lunch. But I just want us to back up and to recognize that God has a plan. God had a plan for Paul, and Paul was fortunate enough to have Jesus tell him directly what that plan was. And we know God has a plan for us, and we know it's in here, but it's not the same direct kind of plan for us that it was for Paul. We don't know all of the details. Well, Paul didn't know all of the details, but we don't even know what city we're going to. We don't know any of what the future holds. We know the end of the story. We know the general, revelation, as it were. Well, okay, I don't want to get myself in too much trouble there, but we don't know specifically where God's going to take us in life, where that journey is going to lead. But God has a plan. His plan is not going to be thwarted. And in as much as we think these things are accidents or mistakes, God is orchestrating his plan in spite of our accidents and mistakes. In fact, sometimes using those accidents and mistakes to bring us around to where he needs us at the time he needs us, to deliver his message to the people that he's brought us to. God has a plan. And we see through this chapter as well that not only does God have a plan, God provides. He has a provision for us. He provided for Paul. He provided for these on the ship. He provided all the way to Rome. And so we came to Rome. God brought us through all these things. And we have to remember, Luke and Paul were well aware that not only did God bring them through these storms, but God is the one in control of the storms. We don't like to say that out loud. We try to be very careful and walk this very fine line between saying what God causes and is responsible for and what he allows. But really, that's just a fine line that we make. You know, God is in control. And either we believe he's sovereign and in control or we don't. And we see in this chapter, God was in control. Paul knew that he was. Paul trusted him. And Paul didn't know exactly what that meant, how they were going to get to Rome. Paul didn't see the storm coming before it happened, but when it was happening, Paul knew what was happening, and he knew God was in control, and he knew that God had a purpose. And, you know, it was fortunate for these sailors that they were with Paul, because God was going to get Paul to Rome, and we know that, and Paul knew that. And so because God got Paul safely to Rome, God got the whole 276 people safely to where they were going. God has a plan and he has a provision. We don't always see what that provision is until afterwards, and sometimes we fail to connect the dots. But God always has a plan and he always has a provision. And the other thing that I want us to see through this chapter that I think God clearly communicates is that God has a salvation that he brings to us. Not only does he have this salvation that is brought to us through Jesus' death on the cross, of course, but through Paul's very presence, Paul saved their lives. Paul saved those in Malta who were ill and were ailing. Paul saved the chief's father, or God saved the chief's father through Paul. Just one last illustration before we get ready to close together this morning. We're all well aware of the story behind that great hymn of the faith, my favorite hymn. Sorry. Tell me what it is. Does anybody know what it is? It is well. I try not to read this whole thing to you. You've heard it before, but there are some things that I wasn't aware of. I don't know the veracity of this particular account, but for what it's worth, Horatio G. Spafford was a successful lawyer and businessman in Chicago with a lovely family, a wife, Anna, and 5 children. And it was in 1971 that their young son, died with pneumonia. And in that same year was the Chicago fire where they lost much of their business. Did I say 1871? Just 2 years later, they had decided to go over to England, and he put his wife and the 4 daughters on this ship. And of course, we know that on the way there, they ended up running into a Scottish ship, it says, iron-hulled Scottish ship. And suddenly all those on board were in grave danger. Anna hurriedly brought her 4 children to the deck. And she knelt down with them there with Annie and Margaret Lee and Bessie and Tanetta and prayed that God would spare them if that could be his will, or to make them willing to endure whatever awaited them. And so, within approximately 12 minutes, the ship slipped beneath the dark waters, carrying with it 256 of the passengers, including the 4 children. A sailor rowing a small boat over the spot where the ship went down spotted a woman floating on a piece of wreckage. Sounds kind of like the scripture this morning, doesn't it? Floating on a piece of wreckage. It was Anna, still alive. He pulled her into the boat, and they were picked up by another vessel, larger vessel, and within 9 days landed in Wales. And from there, she wired her husband with that famous message. Of course, I didn't know it was more than 2 words. It said, "saved alone." It said, "What shall I do? What shall I do?" We've all been in those places where, yes, we know God has provided, but what shall I do? I can remember years ago, many years ago, 1987, when my grandfather died, and I was at my grandmother's house, and she remember her she was still in shock, but she said, "What am I going to do? What am I going to do? What am I going to do?" Another of the ship's survivors, Pastor Weiss, later recalled Anna saying, "God gave me 4 daughters. Now they have been taken from me. Someday I will understand." And that really is the perspective that we need to have when we go through these difficulties in life. And many of us are going through difficulties now, or have recently, or if not, we will be soon. As long as this life continues, we will find those trials. We will find those things in life that God has allowed, has orchestrated for us for some purpose. And some of that purpose is to mold us and make us into his image, we're told in Romans 8:29. Not only are all things to work together for the good of those who love him, but so that we will be formed in his image. That's why he allows those things, at least one reason. Another reason is for us to demonstrate to those around us that we trust him, that we have a faith in him, that we're not going to panic. And so when Peter says that, I always get myself in trouble when I don't have the verse written down, but Peter says that we are to be ready always. That's to give an answer to everyone that asks us a reason of the hope that's in us. That's because there's a hope that's in us. That's because we trust him, and we've gone through those trials, and we've demonstrated that we trust him. And so therefore, someone comes and asks us a reason for that hope that's in us. Why aren't you panicking? Why aren't you collapsing like any other person would be doing? And if we are trusting him, and we are living through that, and we are at least having the response, "Someday I will understand why," then we will be able to give them a reason for the hope that's in us with meekness and fear. Someday I will understand why. God has a plan, and what comes to shock us in life comes as no surprise to him. He is orchestrating events in order to bring about his plan, in order to use us in the way that he will. And if we pay attention, we can see that throughout those bumps in the road, those difficulties, accidents, or disasters, those life-changing events, if we pay attention, we will see that God is providing and caring for us, for his children, just as he promised he would. And as we look back on such challenges in life, we can see that these things are a demonstration of his great salvation. See, salvation is a part of who God is. It's part of his DNA, if you will. In fact, it's his very name, Jesus, comes from Yahweh saves. Just as the angel told Joseph that his wife Mary, his promised wife, they weren't living as man and wife yet, but as she would bear a son, "And you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins." And so may we see these events that occur in our lives that we consider accidents or disasters, may we see them as God's hand working out his plan and providing for us, and ultimately demonstrating salvation that we can experience if we but trust in the name of Jesus.